This is Minda Wilson for Urgent Care. I'm very excited to have Lee Silverstein here. He has an amazing podcast, We Have Cancer, which, if you listen to it, the stories are compelling and stories of courage. It's just a wonderful place to learn on how to live well when you're battling with cancer. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So you met your lovely wife, Linda, and then found out that you had cancer.
3 months later, yes.
And that must have been you must have been gobsmacked.
I was and I wasn't, Minda, because my story goes actually much further back. I'm a survivor of pediatric cancer, more specifically something known as a Wilms tumor, which is a rare form of pediatric kidney cancer. And obviously I came through that fine, but the impact that had on me, even though it happened when I was 5 years old, I continued to be monitored into my mid-20s, really not so much for possible recurrence of the disease. That specific cancer is not known for that, but more to assist Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York with research and statistics, if you will, and I kind of did that as a favor to them. But having gone through that experience just left me hard to explain, but kind of with that feeling that, it wouldn't surprise me if cancer and I cross paths again down the road, even though that childhood cancer has no studies have been done and there's no correlation to adult onset cancers. It was just kind of something that I felt. Not like it was a black cloud that anytime I had an ache or a pain, oh my God, it's cancer. That wasn't it at all. But just kind of, it wouldn't surprise me if this just kind of happened. So when we got the news, of course it was upsetting, but it was a little bit difficult to explain. But my reaction was more, okay, what do we need to do to take care of this, as opposed to, oh my goodness, I can't believe this happened.
Wow. So what do you need to do? What's the steps that people should take when they get a diagnosis like that?
Well, the first thing my gastroenterologist said to me, because this all came out of a routine, quote-unquote, colonoscopy. I had recently turned 50, and the guidelines, and unfortunately now the guidelines have been lowered to 45, say you should get a colonoscopy. And I didn't have any symptoms. That's the other incredible part of my story. So I had no symptoms and woke up from a colonoscopy with, at the time, was stage 2 colon cancer. Mm-hmm. And the first thing my doctor says to me is, do you know a surgeon? And, it's like, that's a lot to take in. Is the first question the doctor says, as opposed to, well, let's meet and talk and plan this out. He kind of threw it back at me. And I think, part of the shock of it was that, I didn't know any better to ask more questions other than to say, actually, I do know a good surgeon from something else that I had dealt with not long ago. But so the learning experience for me, Minda, was you need to sit down and God forbid somebody gets that news, don't make any immediate decisions. Take a day or two to kind of, decompress and get your thoughts together, sit with your loved ones and write out a list of questions, and then meet with the doctor and say, okay, help me understand, here are my questions, what are my options, so that you can make, this life-changing decision, with some thought behind it, if you will.
Well, I think what you're saying, which I noticed with my own mom when she got sick, was after you hear the words, you have cancer, you're not really listening to what's the follow-on to that, because you've been emotionally hit, and you're sort of just processing that news. So, even if someone's with you, if they love you, they're still hearing the same thing you're hearing, which is, my loved one has cancer. So they're not really paying attention to all the follow-on at that moment, because they it's a shock, no matter how emotionally prepared you are for that, right? Even so, you need a little bit to process, right?
No doubt about it. I mean, I can't think of too many other three-word phrases that are harder to take in and are more shocking than to hear those three words. You have cancer, which I've heard more times. I think I've lost count. I think I've lost count. But you're right. You do need that time, because the rest that comes after those three words, for those of us who remember the old Charlie Brown TV specials, were like Charlie Brown's mom, wah, 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 you don't hear anything else.
Exactly. So even though the doctor may be trying to be helpful in that moment, you still have to take your time, which is your point. But then once you do take your time, the follow-on point that you're making is, then you need to be forthright in addressing what's going on with you.
Exactly. And not only should you prepare your list of questions that you have going in, you really should have somebody with you when you go to the appointment, because you don't hear everything you think you hear. And you should always go with a notebook and write down what the doctor says. But I'm soon coming up on 9 years since my initial diagnosis. And it's not uncommon for Linda and I to be at an appointment, and afterwards I say, well, it was interesting that the doctor said X. And she goes, that's not what he said. He said this. So the perfect example, right? And I've been doing this for 9 years now. And I go back and review and talk to him, and sure enough, 99 times out of 100, she's absolutely right. There was one little piece that I missed. So preparation before, and have somebody, if at all possible. But when you go to an appointment where you're talking about treatment and treatment options, have another set of ears with you, because you don't want to miss any important details.
And also, people are affected by the procedures that they go through. So if you're undergoing chemotherapy, if you're undergoing radiation, they talk about chemo brain and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
So that's something that people need to be aware of. So having a listening partner who isn't being affected by these kinds of treatments is also helpful.
Absolutely.
So how did you decide to start the podcast, though? That sort of interested me. Like, in the middle of all this, you're saying, "Oh, let's put on a show. Let's be."
Well, there's a vibrant and active podcast community here in the Tampa Bay area in Florida, and about 5.5 years ago, one of my good friends who oversaw a local networking event mentioned to me that they started talking about podcasting, and I knew what it was, and I'm not sure if I had even listened to one at that point. And he reached out to me because I was working at a local college at the time, and he was looking for meeting space for this new podcasting group. And I said, yeah, we have space available. And they came over for the meeting, and I wanted to be a good host and not just unlock the door and walk away. So I sat in on the meeting, and more for social reasons, because some of my friends were there. And as I'm listening to people talk about podcasting and what they're doing with it and the messages they're sharing, I'm sitting there going, I could do this, and I have an affinity for technology, so that wasn't anything that might have scared me away. And I'm sitting there going, what if I started a podcast where I got the opportunity to speak to patients like myself and caregivers, just to share their stories? So when the meeting wrapped up, I walked over to my good friend and I said, I have a crazy idea. What do you think? And she put a hand on each shoulder, looked me in the eye, and said, oh, my God, you need to do this. And 3 months later, I launched what it was at the time called the Colon Cancer Podcast. A couple of years ago, at a national or global podcasting conference, which, as an aside, I will be attending weekend after this one, weekend of March 6th in Orlando, PodFest Multimedia Expo, where I will be a speaker. And a couple of years later, and talking to some folks, and I said, what can I do? How can I make this grow? How do I reach more people? And they said to me, well, you're talking about colon cancer, but are the stories only relevant to people with that type of cancer? And it was like one of those, why didn't I think about it, smack yourself in the forehead kind of moments. And I said, actually, most of the stories are relevant to any kind of cancer. And from that was born the rebranding of the Colon Cancer Podcast into now, as you mentioned, We Have Cancer.
And the stories are inspiring because, especially, I want to focus on caregivers for a moment because when you're sick, oftentimes the focus is on you, but there's a big burden on caregivers, and there's a big and there's a tendency to burn out over time. So what are some of the things that you can suggest to caregivers to help them sort of cope with the burdens that are placed on them?
Wonderful question, and I so appreciate you asking that because our caregivers are often overlooked, and I tell people all the time, I just don't know where I would be today if I didn't have mine, and fortunately she's the love of my life. But I see it in her eyes when I'm not feeling well, and as a matter of fact, I have my next chemo treatment tomorrow morning, and I know typical for me is that the weekend after treatment, I don't feel real good, and I can just see it in her eyes how hard it is for her to see that. And caregivers need support just like patients do, because to your point, it is so much to deal with. And support can take many forms. It could be a support group that perhaps your medical facility has as an option. It could be a one-on-one appointment with a psychologist, psychiatrist, just to share and get some tips for coping. It could be a Facebook group specifically for caregivers where you can connect and vent and talk to people. But it is really difficult to navigate alone, and support is so important.
And some of the things that and the ability for caregivers to engage in these support groups is getting easier through the web, and most cancer organizations have support groups for the people that are involved in care for people that are suffering from cancer. And also there are some opportunities for them to, through Medicare and Medicaid, for lower income people to be reimbursed for their time as caregiver. And that's something that, people should be aware of.
Great point. You're absolutely right.
So, so when you started reaching out to people, what was the response to to your message? I mean, what was the key to your message, and what was the response to it?
The key to my message, what I noticed is there was, in the podcasting space, there was a real void. There were several cancer-related podcasts, but overwhelmingly, they all seemed to be clinical. So your major oncology centers, your Sloan Ketterings, your MD Andersons, putting on podcasts, but their target audience was the medical community. So it was doctors talking to other doctors. There really wasn't much out there sharing the human stories. And overwhelmingly, Minda, what I've heard from people is, thank you for sharing these stories. It helped me feel less alone. I now realize I'm not the only one struggling with fill in the blank, whatever that issue might be. And that has been the consistent message in the 5 years. And by the way, yesterday was our 5-year anniversary since we launched.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And that's been the consistent message is, You help me feel like I'm not alone. You help me realize I'm not the only one dealing with these situations, that other people are going through the same thing. And lastly, which is part of the tagline of the show, is you've given me hope. And what more can you ask for, right?
Exactly. And loneliness and isolation is one of the significant psychological issues that patients suffer with. So, give me an example of a story that somebody has told you that sort of really you feel has really made a difference to your community.
Oh, shit, this one, I'm going to try to do it without getting too emotional myself. But I connected with a guy out in Oregon. His name was Nate Allen. And Nate sent me an email that he was looking online. He was in chemo. He was depressed. He was going through stage 4 colon cancer, and
Oh,
he was just looking on Google for something. And he said, and I came across your podcast, quote unquote, stories of hope. Hope was exactly what I needed. And I started listening to your podcast while walking because I knew I needed to get some exercise. And what evolved from this, and at the time, Nate and I connected through Fitbit, and I talked about exercise a lot because that's been a coping tool for me, is exercise. And so he started walking, and he started sending me challenges through Fitbit, and I started deleting them because, quite frankly, he was kicking my butt with how many steps he was doing. But the rest of his email was, you gave me hope, and I will never forget that, and I love you for that. And bear in mind, we had never met. And about 9 months later, we did have the chance to meet at a Colorectal Cancer Alliance conference out in Arizona. I believe this was the fall of 2016. And, I gave Nate such a huge hug finally, because I don't get the opportunity to meet many of these people because they're scattered
right.
all over the world. So, and I have met, probably a couple of dozen of them. So obviously based on an email like that, and he was always, anytime I post a new episode, he'd be the first to comment and share. So, we gave each other the biggest hug. And unfortunately, that hug was the last time I saw Nate because he passed away 6 weeks later.
Oh, I'm so sorry. But think about quality of life. I mean, you really gave him you gave him a good attitude, and attitude in when coping with illness is very important, good attitude.
Absolutely.
It may, if you think about what are the things that can make a difference in people's lives, perception and how you look at things and how you deal with things can make a difference. Feeling, part of a community as opposed to alone, and feeling hopeful as opposed to depressed. All these things can really take how you look at a very difficult situation and turn it around for you. And that's what your show offers to people.
That's what we try to do, and it's interesting too, Minda, because one of the things that you ask any podcaster they're guilty of is we're always looking at our downloads. That's one of the advantages of the medium, is you can see how many people have listened to your show.
Mm-hmm.
And I get caught up in that too. And sometimes, I'll say, gee, the numbers aren't quite what they were last month. And then I get an email like the one I get from Nate, which is the slap in the face that I need to remind me that I'm not doing this for the number of listens. I'm doing this for the impact. And if one person can send an email telling me that we've had that impact on them, that's all that matters. And whether their show got 100 downloads or 10,000 downloads, if one person felt like they were no longer alone, felt like they were no longer the only one dealing with their particular struggle, then what we've done was made it all worth it.
And it all seems like they're all stories. Like each episode I saw was really someone's story, you know.
Absolutely. And what people also tell us is the power of hearing the story told by that person. So I'm
Hmm.
not sitting here reading emails or telling them about this person I met. The show is a 100% interview-based show, and the stories are told by the patient, by the caregiver, by the survivor.
And for anyone who needs that inspiration, it's a touchstone to people sharing the same life that they have, right?
Oh, no doubt, absolutely.
So if people want to listen to your podcast or reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do it?
They can find us on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify. The easiest way to find and subscribe to the show for free is through our website, which is wehavecancershow.com. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter at wehavecancerpod. And you can also find us on Facebook under the We Have Cancer Show.
And if people are suffering from colon cancer like you and are interested in resources, what's a good way for them to find out about those resources?
There are about three or four great organizations. You can find them all online in no particular order. Look up on Facebook Colon Town, which is a vibrant community that covers really every possible issue and challenge that anybody facing colorectal cancer. Also, the Colorectal Cancer Alliance, which is ccalliance.org, is a very patient-centric colon cancer organization that also has an online chat, a daily chat, where it's just kind of an online virtual chat for patients and survivors. They have a caregiver-specific chat. I believe that's on Thursday evenings. A grief chat, a stage 4 chat. You can all find that all on their website. The Colon Cancer Coalition, where you can find coloncancercoalition.org, also offers wonderful resources as well.
Well, Lee, thank you so much for being on the show. We look forward to following your journey, and I hope people will listen to your podcasts. This is Minda Wilson for Urgent Care.